Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. If there is one message that I would like to send to the international community ahead of the International Climate Change Conference, it is this. Without Senate approval, there will be no money. Secretary Kerry says that a treaty requiring Senate approval will not emerge from the international climate talks. This is despite the fact that the State Department is pushing for parts of the agreement to be legally binding on the United States. On November 13th, the State Department stated, "Our position has not changed. The U.S. is pressing for an agreement that contains provisions both legally binding and non-legally binding." Any agreement reached in Paris that contains legally binding requirements on the American people must come to the Senate for a vote. This isn't only the right thing to do, it is also what the Constitution requires. As we know, the United Nations Green Climate Fund was proposed during the 2009 Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, Denmark. The fund facilitates a giant wealth transfer of taxpayer dollars from the developed nations to developing nations to help them adapt to climate change. Congress has never authorized funding the Green Climate Fund. The United States and other developing nations have other developed nations have pledged approximately $10 billion for the initial capitalization of the fund with a goal of raising $100 billion annually. That's right. Most people think that's a misprint, but it's true. $100 billion annually is what they're talking about. On November 15th of last year, the Obama administration pledged $3 billion in U.S. taxpayer funds over the 4 years during the G20 meetings in Australia. The administration's fiscal year 2016 budget request asked for $500 million for the fund. We cannot support providing taxpayer dollars to this fund if Congress does not get approval of an agreement. So I want to make it clear to the administration as well as to foreign diplomats across the globe who are looking for U.S. dollars, which is the linchpin of this conference. Without Senate approval, there will be no money. Period. I and many of my colleagues will be sending the President a letter stating that very soon. We've circulated a copy of the letter. Now for the questions. Mr. Cass. It's recently reported in the New York Times, let's see, where is this? Page 1. You don't have to go very far. Page 1 above the fold, Wednesday, November 4th. China is burning much more coal than it claimed. Article states, even for a country of China's size, the scale of the correction is immense. The sharp upward revision in official figures means that China has released much more carbon dioxide, almost 1 billion more tons a year than previously estimated. 1 billion more tons a year than estimated. The increase alone is greater than the whole German economy emits annually from fossil fuels. So, you say, how does this impact the Chinese INDC submission? And should we be premising U.S. action based on a promise from China when they can't even accurately count or won't accurately account their coal consumption?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think the Chinese restatement is an important fact, because in that very article, they actually quote China's climate advisor, somewhat smugly noting this makes it even easier for them to meet their target. China has never committed to a level that its emissions will peak at. It has never committed to how its emissions will decline after that. And so after having already put out its commitment, noting, oh, and actually we're burning a lot more coal than we told you, they are in fact making it that much easier to meet a goal that they were on track to meet anyway, without actually making any changes to their policy.
But it sounds like the cost and concessions to be made by the U.S. in the agreement with China are much more real than what China is ever going to do, and ours have to be done before, 2025, and China can continue to go to peak in the year 2030.
That's correct, and I think what's most concerning about that in some respects is that, we've heard so much at this hearing about the importance of U.S. leadership and about this process we've moved forward with that requires what is essentially called naming and shaming. The premise of getting action from the developing world is that we are going to call out those who do not commit to action and shame them into action. Now, whether that was ever a good idea or not, it is how we've proceeded. And yet the talking points from the most vocal advocates of climate action are now that China is doing a great job.
And Mr. Yulee, if I could ask you, if a sophisticated country like China can't keep up with its emissions, what level of confidence do we have that other countries with fewer resources and capacity will be able to or willing to produce a reliable system for measuring, reporting, and verifying emission reduction activities?
And the Chinese experience, my guess, is nothing new. I think there are a lot of developing countries that don't have a handle on how much greenhouse gas emissions are actually emitting. So it's an excellent question, and I'm not quite sure at this point that measuring, reporting, and verification can be set up so that we can, with assurance, guarantee that the emission cuts they promise are actually going to be delivered.
And then with a question for both of you, if you could. There was a recent opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal by Bjorn Lundberg, who many of you are familiar with, noted that in the run-up to the negotiations, he says, rich countries and development organizations are scrambling to join the fashionable ranks of climate aid, of the donors. This effectively means telling the world's worst off people suffering from tuberculosis, malaria, malnutrition, that what they really need isn't medicine, isn't mosquito nets or micronutrients, but a solar panel. Could the ultimate effect of the negotiations make it actually harder for countries to raise their own people out of the abject poverty in the name of climate change?
I think that's certainly a concern, and I think Senator Wicker called attention to the fact that the UK, under pressure to provide climate finance, has simply said, okay, we will shift our other development aid into climate finance. I think the good news for people in developing countries is that their own leaders are refusing to prioritize emissions cuts over economic growth. The bad news is that the developed world, for the sake of getting a signed piece of paper, may reorient their own aid towards solar panels instead of drinking water.
Mr. Yulee, if I could.
Mr. Cass said essentially what I was going to say. The simple fact is, when you look at what developing countries are doing, they've set their priorities, and the priorities are economic development, poverty eradication, and energy access. It's not about addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and I think that's going to be the way it will be for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.